Well, we're turning, did anyone attend? There were attendees, okay. So hi, we've designed this to partly be a few slides that are, oops, how does this go down? All right, thank you. We've designed this a little bit just to give some overview insights, but also to point you to web resources that you may not know or aware of. And then we'll close that PCORI has just done a new program announcement for their third cycle for this year. So I have just a few slides that give an overview. I am going to comment on plenary sessions. One was the open one, which had many of the PCORI, as you may know, has a board of governors. And so it had speakers from different constituencies as part of that. And it had their insights on the direction PCORI's come from and where it's going. I also am going to share some insights because this is relevant to many of the work going on by many of you, which is big data. And so they had a plenary session talking about data access in this open science environment. Don will be talking about some of the methods, breakouts, and others that he participated in. And we thought, rather than using this whole time just to hear us talk, that we would then maybe open it up for conversation or Q&A. So first of all, I wanted you to be aware of PCORI has done a nice job of archiving the meeting. One of their big themes is to make their information easily digestible and shareable. So if you go to this website, there's archived websites of the individual talks. There's small video recaps and snippets, as well as daily updates. So there you can see the full agenda, and there might be some subtopic areas that we're not covering that might be of interest to you. So I direct you to that. And as Russ nicely opened, the purpose of this meeting was to provide an update to stakeholder communities. So I think it's important to provide context that this is the first really large open research meeting that PCORI had sponsored. And it marked their, believe it or not, 5th year anniversary. I hadn't realized how time had flown. So they were originally enacted out of the Affordable Care Act. As a result, you know, here we are 5 years later. So what they wanted to do was provide an update to who they consider their stakeholder communities. So it's not just patients, but it's payers, it's employers, it's providers, it's legislators and policymakers. They shared highlights, select highlights of their research portfolio, as well as lessons learned in some of their projects in what they called mini summits on some of their high-profile initiatives. There were over 1,000 people there in attendance, so it was a very vibrant group. And importantly, the presenters were equal part, just like they've done in their review committees, equal part patients and stakeholders. And so you very much had a feel that this was a joint collaboration with all groups. So here are my general observations, and it'll be interesting to see if Don had similar or different. You have to also put this into context. The first couple of days before this was a back-to-back meeting with the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. It was in the exact same hotel, in the exact same conference space. So it kind of set itself up for comparison. And the difference in the energy and the buzz was palpable. PCORI is well produced. It's a communication machine. You're walking around. They have people there doing videotaping. You knew that they were producing PR, media buzz, and telling their story. So that was very much a background observation for the meeting. And the future focus, a lot of the talks was to acknowledge what they had done, but there was this sense of urgency that we need to accelerate the dissemination. We need to get results, not just building infrastructure. And many of the speakers were talking about, well, this has been great. There's an eye towards legislative reauthorization in 2019. So the original Affordable Care Act legislation gave, the 7-year period in which there was funding. The original funding came out of the award in the federal government, and over time, where we are now, there's approximately a $2 per covered life fee that payers pay, and that goes into a trust fund and then is used for this research. So it needs to be reauthorized, and in order to do that, we have to show value back to the people that are paying this fee. So that is very clear up and front and center that what they're doing needs to shape the value of what they're doing, what they're talking about. So the open plenary session had many of the board members that are part of PCORI, and they talked about the state of comparative effectiveness research and the patient-centered outcomes research. It was moderated by Victor Mattori, who is at Mayo Clinic and has been very focused on the incorporation or thinking about big data and big science, as well as speakers representing the different constituencies. So Nancy Brown is the CEO for American Heart Association. So spoke about it from the context of here we are as a major policy science association focused on heart diseases. You had the chairman also of more of a partnership to improve patient care. So a patient advocacy group. You also had the business employers represented by Helen Darling, who's representing National Business Group. You had Frida Lewis Hall, who was speaking from the point of view of pharma. You had someone from United Health Group, Lou Sandy, who's talking about it from the payer perspective, as well as the American Medical Association, American Nursing Association. So it was very interesting to see all of their views, and I'm just going to share a couple of slides that gave what I took away from it. So Joe Selby, who is the director of PCORI, commented on a couple things. PCORNet, which some of you may be involved in various forms and fashion, needs to demonstrate the value of this investment. So we've created an infrastructure. Now, how are we going to use it to do the research, but also to perhaps be part of the dissemination? There was an encouragement that when you think about patient-centeredness and you think about patient engagement, to also think about dissemination. And therefore, individual patient involvement is very important because that's been a strategy many have used, but also think about including stakeholder organizations as a way to actually expand the reach and disseminate dissemination. So that may be something for those of you who are writing those plans. Can you involve organizations, not just individuals? And as they said, also look for targeted announcements. They know that they need to show value, and one of the ways that they're looking at doing that is by sponsoring big studies addressing very big, important stakeholder-generated questions. So what does that mean for us as individuals? It might mean that some of that work might come out of Colorado, but it also might mean thinking creatively of partnerships because it's these networks of studies that are going to be where that will be the successful applicants. And this was picked up also by Victor in his talk. It was interesting. Many of us have been thinking about what does big data, big science data, science institute look like. His point of view is that big data, when you think of these large observational kinds of data sets or secondary data, are useful, but not necessarily the solution for what PCORI should be focusing on. Instead, he felt the solution needs to be big trials and what he called big science, and reiterated the importance of PCORI funding these very large studies. What does large mean? He looked at the portfolio of the PCORI's studies that they've funded so far, and he would define large as more than 2,000 patients, really allowing you the diversity or heterogeneity of your sample to look at some of these disparities kinds of questions that PCORI is trying to address. And yet only 10% of PCORI's funded studies fit in this size category. So we might think or expect to see more of their announcements focused on these very large multi-center collaborations. And so he then turned to really focusing on, setting a big vision that we need to move towards breaking down barriers and collaboration at a macro scale. And really talked about that we need ways to get rid of competition that's inherent in various centers and institutes competing with one another, and brings up the point that 85% of all of our applications go silent because we're competing with one another. So it'll be interesting to see to the degree to which PCORI might adopt this spirit. He encouraged the country, PCORI, to think big, like we've done in other big needs in our society, like the Manhattan Project, which is at World War II, and thinking of the atom bomb, the Genome Project itself, the International Space Station. Could we think of these multi-institutional kinds of bringing the best minds into a room together? So he was pushing towards that, and it'll be interesting to see if PCORI might move towards projects like that in a few of the high-profile areas. Now, some of the panel members talked about, where might we look for innovation? Can we look at the banking financial industry and how we think about big data, and how they think about using this data to demonstrate paying for value? The patient side said, what do we really need to break through on true partnerships? We have to improve care. It's moving away from, he called the Jerry Lewis syndrome, where you have the poster child at an event, and truly having the engagement of patients. So we've heard that theme before. The business community was very ecstatic about PCORI's direction. From their point of view, this is interesting for some of us that have been involved in implementation science. They are specifically interested on overuse and overtreatment. They want to see comparative data that looks at benefits and the harms to make those kinds of informed decisions. And they're particularly concerned about high specialty drugs and precision medicine that's coming through, and what that means for their payers in terms of costs. And so these are the kinds of comparative effectiveness questions that they'd like to see. From a pharmaceutical perspective, they thought PCORI has been very important in a symbolic way of making patient-centeredness front and center. So, the patient is not waiting anymore. Their patient is demanding. And the very fact that companies now have Office of Patient Affairs, they saw as a good positive forward. So some of you may want to think about these kinds of companies who might have patient affairs as a stakeholder group that might be involved in some of your questions and so forth. Similarly, for the insurance perspective, they were a little bit more skeptical. They agreed that PCORI is a good thing, and they applaud the patient-centeredness, the focus on disparities, but their criticism, now you can imagine they're the ones that are paying for this, right? They're the ones paying the fee on the head. PCORI's been slow to start. What do they have to show for this investment? And need more than just one large study for decision-making. So they're looking at making very large reimbursement, payment, formulary kinds of decisions. The standard of evidence is more, it's the preponderance of the evidence. And while PCORI may be funding these very large studies, which we say, wow, that's a big study, they look at it as one study amongst all of the evidence. And so I would imagine that the importance of showing value in your research, in your proposals, will be something that will be heavily valued. There is a piece of it in the review criteria that talks about how quickly can your results be implemented and put into practice to change care right away. Think about how you can really differentiate your work and your proposal, I think, in that box would be important. There was also the medical perspective, which many of you are experiencing, that it's in a time of tremendous change. And so this speaker raised the question around greater need on dissemination and being cognizant and aware of, and therefore addressing this knowing versus doing gap. Many people know what's the right thing to do, but it's hard given all of this change that's going on, competing priorities on the doing. So work in that area, from their perspective, they thought was useful. Nursing was also there, and I think speaks for the other kind of healthcare providers that it's meaningful to have the full cadre of providers at the table talking about healthcare delivery. So these were large views, but these are members of the PCORI board, so you might get a sense that this might be guiding and influencing future research announcements. The other plenary session, I'll just have a couple slides on, focused on data access in this era of open science and big data. And it had a blend of science and bioinformatics, but also a blend of ethics. So as you're thinking about the ethical considerations of data access. And so some of the comments from there is this sense that NIH was feeling that we need to show greater confirmation to data sharing and data management policies. So when you're writing these sections of the grant, it's nice, but right now there's no accountability. Our researchers actually following through with the data sharing and management that they had proposed. There was discussion also that in the past that these, the need for data sharing may have been at a threshold, let's say of a $500,000 grant or something like that. They're going to be moving that threshold down, and so now it's going to affect more of everything of the kind of work that we do. And trying to work towards how do we create searchable kinds of data sets. So there was recognition that this is the vision, but we don't have it built yet. There was recognition that in an academic world, we need more incentives to support doing this. So a lot of the work that's going on here, I think within Accords and CCTSI with Michael Kahn and Lisa Schilling, how do you think about supporting the scholarship of big data? What does that look like in terms of not just the research data that comes out, but the programming, the looking at it in terms of the coding and the dictionary and all of that that's needed in order to do the research, that there's scholarship in that as well. And that this needs to be seen as equal kind of scholarship and promotion and tenure. So it may be that NIH is trying to move and work towards that, and perhaps PCORI as well. And I think in light of the fact that there's a big gap between what we vision in data sharing and data management versus reality, there was a sense that, well, some change in the right direction at a reasonable cost is better than nothing. The other members, let's see, I may have, yeah. The other was that discussion around patient engagement is needed as we pursue open science. Did I? Yeah. Patient engagement. So, and I think we have leaders here on campus that are doing this. I know Michael Kahn, he has a PCORI methods grant, is very much doing patient engagement. He's working with Julie Barnard here in Accords, is a methods grant on thinking about data quality and how you engage stakeholders in that voice. This is an extension of that kind of work as to how do you also bring patient engagement around issues of open science and informed consent, et cetera. So this speaker, who is a lawyer who's at Stanford, talked about lessons from genetic research and talking about, you know, patients have high willingness to contribute their data if there's controlled access. The willingness depends on private versus nonprofit industry users. It depends on the trust in the institution that's handling the sharing of their data. In most everyone, 3/4 wants to be asked for consent to share their data, but the challenge is it's hard to really anticipate all the future use of the data that's being collected. So, you know, if you think of cell lines or genetic data, it's hard to anticipate what might be used in 10 years. But I think this all speaks to a lot of the work that folks here on campus have been working on, is governance, and really being good in the governance and how patient and stakeholder engagement is included in the governance and will be an important piece of these kinds of open science moving forward. She mentioned that they have a survey study that's underway specifically to look at what participants want, value, and need regarding their use of big data. And so we'll be paying attention to see when that might publish. So those were some of the highlights that I took away from PCORI. Before Don talks, we wanted to make sure that you may have seen the announcement, it came out last week, that there is now 2015 cycle 3, and the letters of intent, these are 3 pages, roughly single spaced, due mid-November. Applicants will be notified if they've been selected to move forward, and the applications are due mid-February. And if you look at the related opportunities, these slides will be posted. If you don't want to look yourself, you can click from here. But you can see there's, you know, the traditional ones that we've had, improving healthcare systems, communication and dissemination, et cetera. But here you also see their big study areas, oral anticoagulants, treatment-resistant depression, multiple sclerosis, and then managing and reducing long-term opioid use for chronic pain. And so if you are interested in those areas, you know, you can imagine that there's going to be large teams and groups working together across institutions for those. So I'll turn it over to Don, and then we can open it up for Q&A. How's that sound?
All right. Thanks, Elaine. So as Elaine mentioned, I direct our Community Engagement Corps for CCTSI. So we've been pretty involved with PCORI through that work. The pilot grant that Russ mentioned, we also have a methods grant. And we've also been very involved in PCORI's Pipeline to Proposal program, which was really sort of modeled off of our CCTSI Community Engagement Pilot program. So we've had lots of opportunities to interact with PCORI, and I've heard Joe Selby talk at various meetings, and they convened their pilot awardees about a year and a half ago for a meeting. And I have to say, sort of watching their evolution over the past couple of years, couple of even 3 years, they're starting to really begin to refine their messaging. I think they're getting more kind of a sense of who they are and what they want to be. It was interesting. I got invited to their methods summit, which was the Tuesday morning before the actual meeting got started, and there were multiple folks that used the word toddler organization. And Elaine mentioned they're 5 years into it, but if you think about the fact that their first awards just finished up this spring, and those were 2-year pilot awards. So, their regular grant cycles, they don't even have results out of those yet. They've got early stuff, but it's still very, very new. And I think that all the PCORI staff that I interacted with and talked to really emphasized the fact that they're learning. They're very interested in input and feedback from people that are applying, that are trying to figure out the process. They really are very sensitive to the fact that their process is different from NIH and AHRQ and other federal agencies, and so they recognize that there's a learning curve there, both for us, for our Office of Grants and Contracts, all that, and so they're emphasized that they really want to be responsive to investigators' needs as they're making applications. Just a couple other observations to build on what Elaine talked about. I think one thing that I picked up on was that, yes, they're coming up to their renewal in a couple of years here in 2017, but it was very interesting to hear the different board members talk about that in their different perspectives. I think they're very sensitive to the fact that that's moving, but they're also not wanting to completely be beholden to that. So they're, as I said, they've got a sense now of who they are, what they're trying to do, and I think they're going to stick kind of by their overall mission. And that relates to the fact that while in the minds of some, they were just funded to do comparative effectiveness research, I think Joe Selby spoke to this. Their perspective is, well, there's actually more to patient-centered outcomes research than just CER. And so they're committed to going beyond that and funding more than just CER types of things. I mean, most basic example is, the recognition that, there's methods development and that sort of thing that needs to happen that they've been supporting through the Methods Award Program, the Eugene Washington Awards Program that's really focused on developing knowledge about how to best disseminate things, the Pipeline to Proposal, which is really designed to develop partnerships between researchers and communities. I think all that sort of speaks to this broader portfolio. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Methods Summit in a little bit more detail, but I think some of the breakouts that I attended, in addition to the plenaries, were related to engagement methods and that sort of thing. And I think the message came through over and over again from the folks that they were highlighting that were current awardees was that meaningful engagement, and what they're valuing at PCORI is that meaningful engagement takes time. It's not just something that you can kind of, okay, I've got this grant idea, and who can I call? That makes it challenging for us if you don't have those kinds of relationships. But I think there was a strong emphasis in that. And I will say this probably more than once, but CCTSI Community Engagement, we're here to help. So we've got relationships with communities around the state. If there are ways that we can help you get connected, get those conversations started. We're really interested in doing that. The other thing that I got a chance to do that was interesting was they pulled together, I don't know, probably 7, 8 awardees for kind of a special dinner with some of their pre and post award contract people. And again, they emphasized there that they really, if you can't figure out, what you really want in the engagement section, call them up. They're sensitive to the fact that early on they weren't fully staffed up. So sometimes it was hard for them to be as responsive as they wanted to be, but they feel like they're more able to respond to those kind of questions and requests. Really encouraged us to send those their direction. So the Methods Summit, just to say a few words about that, and then I think Elaine and I are very interested in questions that you guys have that we might be able to respond to. The Methods Summit, as I mentioned, it was a full morning. Michael Kahn was there as well, as Methods awardee along with his team. They started off by talking about the methodology standards report. So as you're applying to PCORI, that's definitely something you should familiarize yourself with. So that, and they emphasize, the more that you can refer to methods that are in that standards report, the better off you're going to be when you're submitting your applications. They talked about when they were first kind of meeting to pull this together, I think there were like, total staff at PCORI was less than 10, and they're kind of operating on a shoestring. And so there was a sense of, we know it's not perfect, and I think they've just published their first kind of revision of it, but they're continuing to work on this, continuing to develop it, but again, emphasize that they want folks to pay attention to that. They've kind of tried to lay out the sense of sort of where the guardrails are in terms of methods that they want folks to be using. The second part of it was really focused on some individual projects that Methods awardees have been doing. And I'll just read some of these so you can kind of get an idea of what the breadth of these Methods projects were. So measuring patient-centered communication for colorectal cancer care and research. Very interesting talk on visual displays of qualitative data to advance PCOR. And then we had on the complete other end of the spectrum, methods for heterogeneity of treatment effects, random forest counterfactual machines. So they're really kind of, again, kind of pushing both sides, both the quantitative, the qualitative, and the engagement science. I think as Elaine and I have talked, dissemination science, I think, is also something they're looking to push as well. Let's see if I have anything else I wanted to lay out, because I think that's it.
Yeah, so we can open it up for comments. I also want to say, just to kind of build on where John ended, is you have to put together a dissemination plan for ideas, and that's less developed than the engagement rubric. So again, it's this sort of, they're building as they go. So I want to offer, part of my role at the CCTSI as well as at Accords with West Glasgow is to provide consultation around dissemination plans and how they might be framed in a way that, while the methods are being, or the rubric, I should say, is being formed, that is a justifiable scientific way. So there's ways to do that, and we're open for consultation on that.
Yeah, I just add to that. I think they're clearly thinking hard about dissemination, and one of the things I heard talked about, and they're sort of piloting this with the pilot awardees. They've made available separate funding for dissemination after you finish, as you're exiting your through pilot awards. So we picked up a couple of those awards, very brief. We kind of gave them feedback they're too brief. 4 months is pretty tough. But they're experimenting with kind of different things of this. They're interested in feedback about whether you can really fit dissemination into the actual primary award. And so,
Right. So that might be areas that you could maybe build into the grant that talks about how you're designing your work for dissemination. And so that's where some successful grantees have laid it out in that way, right?
Exactly.
So it shows that you're being thoughtful. So, any questions, comments, concerns?
How many folks have applied to PCORI? So few.
Is this helpful? Okay.
Is there anything about when they would be open up the pipeline for folks here?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. Those are probably going to be coming soon. I can't say exactly when. Honestly, there's been some struggle within PCORI about how these Tier 3 awards get framed. You know, the initial, I think, vision, again, similar to what we do within CCTSI, was that Tier 3 was going to be actual pilots being done with your partners. The unfortunate thing that they discovered into this is that the source of funds that they used within PCORI to get approval and fund the pipeline awards was not earmarked for research. So why this has been delayed is they're working to figure out how they can get around that. So that's what's going on. That's why that's been a little bit later than we were hoping.
So do you have a Tier 1 or 2 award?
No, but submitted for one, and they recommended for Tier 3.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, because you're already.
So now you're waiting.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing is many people have applied. It's each cycle is almost a little different, right? So you have to really stay on top of this next cycle. What specifically do you need to fill out this time?
Right.
You can't count on, oh, I just submitted one last cycle, therefore it's the same. It's still, I think.
That's the downside of submitting to a learning organization.
Right. The upside, everyone is learning, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like there's anyone that has that RO1 master that you're, everyone's trying to figure it out. Any other questions? Okay. Well,
I just would say I really would encourage to make use of the resources on our website. The recordings from the meeting the summaries I think are useful to take a peek at. And I think again they're really trying to get better descriptions of what they're looking for, but reach out to them and reach out to us as well.
Great. Happy to help. Thank you.